I have a couple of questions based on my colleagues' questions, and I'm just going to get right to the point here. I was a prosecutor for 18 years, so that's how I get right to the point. First of all, I just was in Africa 2 weeks ago on the continent. I was in Ghana and Liberia. It was an extraordinary, eye-opening, heart-wrenching experience, particularly in Liberia. After 13 years or 14 years of war, civil war albeit, the first female president, Ellen Sirleaf, has taken control of the situation and seems to be doing an excellent job, but she has her work cut out for her, particularly the abuse of women and children. And this seems to be a thread running through the entire, at least from my experience, southern part of the continent of Africa. But be that as it may, I get the impression that the administration is accepting the status quo, almost a hands-off approach. And please correct me if I am wrong, but if I am wrong, please give me, Ambassador Yamamoto and anyone else who wants to chime in on this, please give me specific examples of this not happening.
Congressman Marino, you raise a very fundamental issue in the role of development, and I defer to Sarah as well. But, you know, as ambassador in both in Ethiopia and Djibouti, and of course I served in Sharjah and Guinea-Conakry, one of the issues that we were committed to, and Secretary Clinton really raised this during her trips to Africa, is the status of women. By raising the status of women and fighting the issues of sexually based violence, we can not only enhance the integrity, the honor, and the status of women, but also development, and also create stability in those communities. And that's something fundamental right now that's really changed dramatically, certainly in this administration. It's come out very, very prominently in all the programs that we're doing throughout the continent. And I think the Secretary Clinton received a call from Johnson Sirleaf, and I think immediately she went off for the inauguration to lend support to the efforts and the issues that she takes very personal and she supports very strongly. And that's something that our Secretary has done as well throughout her trips, and she'll be making another trip to Africa. But the programs, I'll give you one example. What we did in East Africa right now through USAID and the programs is we have these community-based development projects where we do community schools, and for the moms we do micro-enterprise loans. For the dads, we're doing agricultural progress because 80% are agricultural based. We're doing land certification programs and other issues. But what we're finding out is that for daughters, their moms are their heroes. This is an issue that we're expanding, and this is a project and program that AID and the State Department and our embassies are really taking a hands-on and supporting. And as we talk to our ambassadors, this is one of the things that we're looking at and hearing stories throughout the continent. But, you know, Sarah, you want to?
And just, I'll get back to you in one moment, but please, Dr. Mendelson.
I've had the pleasure of, over the last several months, working very closely on the National Action Plan with my colleagues from USAID and State and the White House. And really under the leadership at USAID of Administrator Shaw and Deputy Administrator Steinberg, who has decades of commitment to the issue of women, war, and peace, we are really trying to advance a paradigm shift where issues of the safety and security of women and children are woven through our entire understanding of what stability and development is. If the National Action Plan is actually fully implemented, we would have, through the Department of Defense, Department of State, USAID, a very different conception of how we engage in stability. It would be both standalone programs, but really fully woven through every health, education, fully integrated. And I think it is, as somebody who is a private citizen, worked on this for a long time, it is potentially extremely exciting. And of course, the President of Liberia herself was one of the authors of UN Resolution 1325, very involved in the whole concept of women, war, and peace. So, you know, it's taken 10 years. We've come late to the game in many ways, but we are fully committed to implementing this over the next many months.
Dr. Baer, care to comment?
Sure. First of all, thank you for the question. You're doing a good job of channeling the chairman, because it was the kind of question that I've grown used to getting from him. So, and of course, I share others.
There will be more following.
Good wishes for him. I mean, no person of good conscience could possibly look at the continent of Africa and accept the status quo, and nobody that I work with in the administration does. And so, first of all, let me say that. I think there are a range of ways that we're engaging, and oftentimes the most important ones are in small ways. One of the things, for example, that we're doing is working on helping train women journalists, because one of the things we've found is in order to get the problems of women and children solved, you have to get the stories of women and children out. And so training women journalists across Africa is one of the things we're focusing on. More specifically, we've taken concrete action in the multilateral sphere to focus attention on crises in Africa that have particular impact on women and children, like the conflict in Cote d'Ivoire last year, which we raised at the Human Rights Council and have supported follow-up action since. I was out in Western Cote d'Ivoire in October. That continues to be an issue of concern. There are ways that we, our ambassadors across the continent, at Secretary Clinton's direction and under the support of Ambassador Verveer, are focusing their attention on women community leaders, particularly because, as Sarah says, we've learned the lesson over the last 20 years that peace and security arrangements that don't include women and women's views do not work. And so it is absolutely the case that this administration is focused on improving not only the condition of women, but also their participation in solving the problems that face the continent.
Okay. And I completely understand your compassionate positions in this. Believe me, I do. And Ambassador Yamamoto, I equate it to you're walking, as you come in here, you're walking on a tightrope with one end in our hand, and we're not quite sure where the other end's connected. So you have a fine line to walk. But let me pose this scenario, and I credit Secretary Clinton for being there for the inauguration of the president. I missed it by a couple of days. I wish we could have been there, but we weren't able to. But we did meet with her and have a lengthy conversation. But all the programs that you have implemented and you hope to implement concerning raising the level of the female, the women's proper role, I mean, let's face it, it always seems, no matter where we're at in the world, that the wives, the mothers, the grandmothers are keeping the rest of us focused and narrow. I know that's the way in my home. That's just the way it is. It was when I was raised, my grandmother and my mother, and my wife just took over, and instead of having 2 kids, she calls me the 3rd kid. But be that as it may, as devoted as our intentions are, what do we do with Tshisekedi, who just says, I'm not going to cooperate, and still has the control that he exercises? What do we do about an individual like that, regardless of the programs that are implemented? And Ambassador, please, would you please start off?
As you know, we provided what is about $7 billion in assistance programs. Most of it's earmarked, but the issue is that we distribute and implement most of our program, over 80%, through NGO groups with the social, civil societies and communities in the communities locally, not through the governments. And that's how we get through and around leaders or people who are opposed to it.
How do you get Tshisekedi's attention? Seriously get the attention?
That's that's difficult. We have, speaking with him, he has a very strong-minded mind, but the question comes in is talking to not only him, but also to his people. And that goes back to, I think, back to the DRC on a type of government that is going to be formed after this election. And we've called for inclusive government. So that means inclusion of all parties and all groups, including Tshisekedi's people, not himself, but so that helps to influence that wing of the opposition party.
I understand your diplomatic responsibility and approach, believe me, and I would not trade positions with you for all the money in the world. But I seem to, it's just not connecting.
Let me. One thing is that I'm getting more notes here.
That's all right, please. Take your time, and I understand.
I think it's very telling that, Mr. Tshisekedi called for a general strike, and very few people came to the party to participate, which I think is telling. But more important is going back to your heart of your question is, how do we really bring a societal change? How do we bring fundamental changes? And at every level, we have thought with AID, with our colleagues, and I'll give you some examples. Some things that we have done over the last decade. We have trained 140,000 peacekeeping troops throughout Africa. AFRICOM has helped in training. The 391 Battalion in the DRC is part of that process, not only for peacekeeping, but also civilian control. The other issue is security sector reform, which is fundamental, basic, through all the countries and all the development, because SSR is really critical if you want to see rapid development. The other issue, too, is, I'll give you an example, is the formation of the Africans themselves, of forming groups and like Amazon in Somalia. They're doing it themselves because that's an integral threat to them. And so our job is to help support those efforts. And I think by giving the societal changes and dramatic changes at the basic level, I think that's going to speak volumes and help over the long term.
I think we need to bring more attention on an international basis, a significant attention, and expose what is taking place there for what it's worth or not worth. Let me pose this, if you don't mind. I've seen the women in Liberia and certainly in Ghana taking a very aggressive and important role, but are we setting up perhaps an environment for the equation of an Arab Spring?
In Liberia and Ghana?
Yes. Well, no, excuse me, no. In what we're talking about right here in the DRC, when you see you're implementing these programs, I'm sorry for not being clear on that.
Okay. Obviously, Ghana remains kind of a bright spot of
sure does.
gains in the continent. And actually, yes. Speaking to your comments earlier, I lived in Ghana for a time, and one of my favorite sayings there was, "When an old woman dies, it's like a library has burned." Mm-hmm. And certainly the appreciation of women's leadership is something that we hope to see elsewhere. I don't think we predict. Obviously, there are conditions unique to every context, including in the Middle East, where we've seen political transitions this year. And while there is some similarity, there have been different causes and events that have led to them. I don't think we predict any that type of political transition in the near term in the DRC. I think what we do predict is that the tensions that are there now, the political tensions between Kabila and the opposition, are tensions that need to be dealt with, and they need to be dealt with in a meaningful way in order for people to be satisfied. And the good news is there are a range of things that the president can do and that others in the government can do to bring civil society and to bring the opposition into conversation and dialogue and to move the country forward. And one of the things that they can do is commit to better election processes going forward, and that is something that they will have the support of the international community to do.
Okay. Dr. Mendelson.
Our programs did not cause the Arab Spring, for better or worse. The dignity.
If that's what you think. I inferred I did not.
The dignity and respect agenda that we saw on display in both Tunisia and Egypt are obviously very powerful for people around the world, but they are fundamentally the responsibility and revolution of Tunisians and Egyptians. And I think a lot of us are very humbled in watching them. But the programs that we conduct and the support we have to Congolese civil society and the population are just as Dan said. I think that the ability to have independent critical media better election architecture, civil society organizations that are robust and listening and responding to the needs of the population are important. They're part of our values, and they're in response to demand on the ground.
And we have to also be addressing issues, keeping our eye on a month, 6 months, a year down the road, because we don't want to be caught in a position where we're caught off guard again, and the disasters that could happen because we're looking at this particular moment in time instead of not trying to calculate and predict what the future may bring. You agree with me there?
Totally agree. We're not, at least we at USAID, are particularly good at predicting the future, but maybe our colleagues at the State Department are better at it. But I will say that we as an administration have been very focused on what is called the Presidential Study Directive 10. In August, the President launched a process where we're looking at atrocity prevention. We're trying to figure out what tools we can bring to bear, where the gaps are, early warning systems, response. Obviously, this is about political leadership. But in the context like the DRC, we're really actively working to try and figure out what are there technological fixes? Should we be using certain kinds of, and we mentioned the cell phones and the cell towers, are there ways in which we can better organize ourselves to be responsive? Do we see patterns of violence?
None of us are going to be able to predict the future with accuracy, but my position has always been before we make a radical change into something, we have to sit down and seriously, you folks have to sit down and seriously ask yourselves and consult with us if you want our input or any assistance. What happens if?
Well, we are also actually in the process of a 5-year strategic planning process. We see this as an enormous opportunity to put everything on the table and say, how do we get to where we want to be? What should we be doing more investments in the democracy sector? Should we be doing less in others? What does the recent past tell us about what we should be doing differently?
Okay.